they just haven't realized that their messaging isn't as effective as it used to be? Like, have they just not pivoted completely yet? Or is it just that they fundamentally, because they have to be opposed to NATO, for example, that they can't fully shift and make Europe feel better about their position?
I think it's probably a mix of three things. One is that I do think their understanding of European dynamics is not great. Like, they have some understanding of inter-European conflict. Like, they know that they can get Hungary to side with China when it comes to, certain statements. They know that there are certain rivalries between different countries inside the EU that they can exploit if they're smart about this. But the Chinese government does not have a great understanding of the dynamics, the inner dynamics in politics inside European countries. You can see that when sometimes they will, do events with people that are completely marginalized in Europe, but are then, trotted out as the great supporters of China. So that understanding of the inner European dynamics is simply not big.
Why do you think that is? I'm just curious because, it seems like China perfectly understands the political divide in the United States
and how to exploit that.
And but why don't they understand the subtleties of Europe?
I mean, obviously, I have to speculate here. I don't know why why the Chinese government is ignorant on that. My guess would be that it's simply not seen as that relevant. Like, the way that the CCP frames the world is very much centered on big powers. If you look at how the CCP frames any conflict, whether it's that in its own neighborhood or whether it's a conflict in Europe, it's very much about the US being the big bad hegemon that is then coercing its proxies.
Wow, that's really Cold War thinking.
Yes, that's what makes all of this, Cold War mentality talk of Chinese spokespeople so ironic. It's very Cold War bloc thinking. It's us versus the United States. And any smaller power, I do think, they keep saying this in their own propaganda that, those countries are only proxies for the US and Europe is just a proxy, and, Europe is suffering while the US is profiting from this war. So I really think they don't really view most countries around the world as independent actors, as independent countries that have agencies, that have legitimate interests of their own, that are completely separate from the US's, but happen to align with those interests of the US to a certain degree. Like, that's just not a category that exists in the political thinking of the parties. If you don't agree with China on something, or if you take action against China, it can only be if you're a small country because the US put you up to it. If you look at, how China is framing its conflict with the Philippines. If you look at how it's framing its conflict with Lithuania, where it's also, Lithuania is basically said to be a running dog of the US, which, no, Lithuania has its own interests. Same for Australia. Like, the Chinese government, the CCP, simply cannot imagine that Australia, Lithuania, the Philippines, Vietnam, any country is acting out of its own interest rather than simply being instigated by the US. So I do think in that regard, maybe the party is falling victim to its own narratives. That, why would you look at what those countries think if your own narrative that you repeated so often that you now believe in it is that they are only acting as US proxies? So, of course, you look at what the interests of the US are, not what those stupid proxies are thinking or doing. So I think that's part of the reason. Why else does China not understand this? What's going on? I think, or why else does China say NATO is to blame or the US is to blame? The way I've put this since the beginning of this war is it feels like both Putin and Xi Jinping are drunk on their own rhetoric of great changes unseen in a century. They've repeated so often that, the world is undergoing change, the US is in decline, China and other powers are on the rise. I do think that's something that really, that belief fundamentally informs their decisions. And that's also why I think the CCP was so upset when Europe told it you're on the wrong side of history, because determining the right side of history, that's the prerogative of the party. And no, you can't have, Europeans go do that. And that's why they immediately shot back, no, you're on the wrong side of history, because again, in their view, history is moving in a direction where the US is declining and China is rising, and everybody who doesn't fall in line is on the wrong side of history.
Well, that's a social evolution of Marxism, communism. Like inevitably, society moves towards communism, socialism, communism. So of course, they're on the right side of history.
Yeah, but I do think there is, I do think that again, political leaders inside the CCP have fallen victim to their own rhetoric here, and they can't really move away from it. And then the third factor I was going to name for why China is sticking with this approach is, and again, obviously, I think I'm not the first person to say this, but I guess it's quite what we can see is that the current political environment inside the party in China isn't conducive to people who have a nuanced, well-founded, rational take on other countries, and who have this good understanding of those complex dynamics, and who communicate those complex dynamics in a rational fashion to the top leadership. The current political environment seems to be more conducive to producing wolf warrior types who confirm to the top leadership its own biases, its own views of the world, and therefore probably significantly help reinforce those biases. So those are the main three reasons why I think China isn't moving away from this blame NATO, blame the US rhetoric.
That last point is really interesting because it makes me think about after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the party instigated this whole patriotic education campaign because they didn't want university students getting the idea that they could start protesting the party or for basic human rights. And now you have like a couple generations of people who have grown up under this sort of rigid ideological framework, and now they're getting into positions of power. And like, did that actually come back to bite the party in the end? It solved one problem for the party, but then just created another massive issue. Something to ponder.
Quite possibly, yeah. I do think, again, there's still people in the government right now that didn't necessarily grow up in those times. And I think they're just being sorted in other ways. And, the people that are more likely to have differentiated, nuanced views or, just eliminated fairly quickly or marginalized fairly quickly and not in a position where they can tell Xi Jinping the bad news. Just like I could imagine that right now in Russia, people don't want to give Putin bad news. Nobody's vying for that position where you give Putin the updates on the war.
No one wants to be sitting on the other end of that really long table.
Yeah.
It just seems like a bad spot to be on that terrible table. So
here, drink this.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh God.
It's kind of absurd how drinking, asking someone to drink tea, because to me it's got such a Chinese meaning of simply bringing someone in to give them a lecture on how they need to be more constructive. But of course, in the Russian context, it takes on a more sinister.
Radioactive.
They've subverted tea. That's their greatest crime.
Well, I do think that there's something about the entire. When you were talking about how nobody wants to be the person to give Xi Jinping bad news or Putin, like there's something about the entire way that the Chinese Communist Party is set up that, everybody is afraid of being the bearer of bad news. Like nobody wants to be, for example, the city that zero COVID doesn't work in, right? No one wants to, you just never. So even if you had this nuanced view or you thought that, maybe we're shooting ourselves in the foot by being so aggressive, you're not going to say that if you want to keep your job intact, et cetera.
Yeah. Which really isn't new. I mean, nobody wanted to tell Mao, hey, you know what? Maybe farmers should farm.
Yeah. It's been a real problem. The ironic part is, of course, it's been identified by the party as a problem. And for years, like the party actually had campaigns to counter this, 报喜不报忧, like only reporting the good news and not the bad news. They were like trying to counter that. But in the last 10 years, it feels like that's really done a 180-degree turn. And, it's clearly a situation again where you don't want to be the bearer of bad news. You don't want to be the city where COVID breaks out and then you get fired or worse as an official. So, yeah, it's not a great situation. It's pretty dangerous since, stuff doesn't stay in China or in Russia.